"If you tease me like that again," he said softly, "you might not like how it ends." I should have laughed it off like I did with every other customer that walked into that bar, but something about the way he said it stayed under my skin long after I turned away. At the time, though, I still thought he was harmless. It was a Thursday night, the kind that dragged on forever, where the neon lights buzzed overhead and the air smelled like cheap whiskey and lemon cleaner. I'd been on my feet for 10 hours straight, my sneakers sticking slightly to the floor with every step as I moved between tables, balancing trays and forcing smiles that felt thinner by the minute. Tips had been bad all week, rent was due in 5 days, and my manager had already warned me about attitude, which really meant I didn't laugh enough at bad jokes from men who thought a $20 bill made them charming. So yeah, maybe I pushed a little harder than usual. Maybe I teased a little sharper. It was how I survived. That's when he walked in. Not flashy, not loud, no entourage, no expensive watch flashing under the lights. Just a man in a dark jacket, sitting alone at the far end of the bar like he didn't belong to the noise around him. If anything, he looked quiet, the kind of quiet that usually meant boring. I grabbed a glass, wiped it down, and walked over with my best half smile. "What can I get you?" I asked, leaning slightly against the counter. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me, not the way most men did. Not checking me out, not trying to impress me, just looking, like he was reading something I hadn't said out loud. "Bourbon," he finally said. His voice was low, calm, controlled. I poured it, slid it toward him, then tilted my head. That all? No complicated order? No surprise me nonsense? A small pause. Then, barely noticeable, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "I don't like surprises." "That's a shame," I said, tapping the counter lightly. "Life's more fun when you don't try to control everything." I don't know why I said that. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I liked poking at people who looked too composed. He picked up the glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with precise control. Then his eyes met mine again, sharper this time. "Careful," he said. Just one word. Simple, but it landed heavier than it should have. I leaned closer, lowering my voice like I was sharing a secret. "Or what?" That was when his hand moved. Not fast, not rough, just enough to catch my wrist before I pulled away. His grip was firm, steady, like he wasn't even trying. My pulse jumped under his fingers, and I hated that he could probably feel it. "If you tease me like that again," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine, "you might not like how it ends." For a second, everything around us blurred. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. It all faded under the weight of his voice. And then I did what I always did when something made me uncomfortable. I smiled. I pulled my wrist free, stepped back, and let out a soft laugh like none of it mattered. "Relax," I said, shaking my head. I was kidding. He didn't laugh, didn't move, just watched me like I'd said something important without realizing it. I turned away first, went back to my other customers, back to the noise and the chaos and the familiar rhythm of pretending everything was normal. But I felt it, that shift in the air, like something had quietly changed, and I was the only one who hadn't caught up yet. I thought he was just another guy passing through. I thought I'd read him right in the first 5 seconds. I was wrong, and I didn't realize how wrong I was until the entire room started reacting to him before he even stood up. I tried to ignore it at first, the way the atmosphere shifted without anyone saying a word. But you notice things when you spend enough nights behind a bar. You learn how to read a room the way other people read headlines. And this room had just gone quiet in a way that did not match the music still playing overhead. Glasses still clinking, conversations still technically happening, but softer now, more careful, like everyone was suddenly aware of something they could not see directly, and I felt it most when I glanced back toward him and realized he had not moved at all, still sitting there with that same calm posture, that same unreadable expression, but the space around him felt different, like people were giving him distance without meaning to, like gravity had shifted in his direction and everything else was adjusting around it. And I told myself I was imagining it because I had seen confident men before, powerful men, men who liked to think they owned the room just because they could afford the liquor in it. But this did not feel like that. This felt quieter, heavier, like something that did not need to prove itself. "Emily," my manager called from behind me, his voice lower than usual, which alone was enough to make me turn. "Just keep things smooth tonight, okay?" I frowned slightly, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. I always keep things smooth, I said. But he did not argue. He just nodded once and walked away. And that was when I noticed he had glanced toward the far end of the bar before speaking to me, toward him, and something about that made my stomach tighten in a way I did not like. I picked up another glass, forced myself back into motion, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying that moment when his fingers had wrapped around my wrist, steady, controlled, like he already knew exactly how much pressure to use, not enough to hurt, just enough to stop me. And I hated that it had worked. I hated that my pulse had jumped, that my breath had caught. So I did what I always did when something got under my skin. I pushed back. I grabbed the bottle of bourbon again and walked straight toward him, ignoring the way two guys at a nearby table suddenly went quiet as I passed, ignoring the way one of them actually shifted his chair slightly to give me more room, like I was carrying something fragile instead of just a glass bottle. I stopped in front of him, set the bottle down with a soft tap against the counter, and leaned in just enough to make it clear I was not intimidated. "You look like you could use another one," I said lightly, tilting my head the same way I had before, testing, always testing. His eyes lifted to mine immediately, no delay, no distraction, like he had been aware of every step I took getting back to him. "I did not finish the first," he said, his voice as even as before. I glanced at the glass, still half full, then back at him. "Maybe you are not drinking it right," I said, letting a small smile pull at my lips. And there it was again, that subtle pause. Not surprise, not confusion, just a moment where the air seemed to tighten between us, like something unseen had leaned closer. "Or maybe," he said slowly, setting the glass down with deliberate care, "I do not rush things that matter." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head as I reached for the glass, my fingers brushing the edge of it. "It is bourbon, not a life decision," I said, but my voice felt a fraction less steady than I wanted it to, and I knew he heard it because his gaze did not shift, did not soften. It just stayed there, steady, focused, like he was cataloging every change in me the same way I had tried to read him earlier. And for the first time that night, I felt like I was the one being studied instead of the other way around. A group near the door suddenly stood up all at once, chairs scraping softly against the floor, and I glanced over instinctively, thinking maybe there had been some kind of issue, but they were not arguing, not laughing, not even talking much. They were just leaving, quickly, quietly, like they had somewhere more important to be. And one of them, a guy I recognized as a regular who never missed a chance to stay for one more drink, avoided looking in our direction entirely as he passed, like eye contact was something to be careful with. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. And when I looked back at the man in front of me, he was already watching me again, like he had noticed the shift too, or maybe like he had caused it. "You should be more careful who you play with," he said, not as a warning this time, not quite, more like a statement of fact, something already decided. I crossed my arms lightly, leaning my weight onto one hip to hide the way my balance felt slightly off. "And you should try being less dramatic," I replied, but the words did not land the way they had earlier. They felt thinner, weaker, like even I did not fully believe them anymore. He held my gaze for a long second, then another, and in that silence, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely new way. He was not trying to intimidate me. He was not trying to impress me. He was simply allowing me to keep going, like I had been given space to make a mistake I did not understand yet. And that realization settled heavy in my chest just as the front door opened again, and a new voice cut through the room, louder, careless, completely unaware of the shift that had already taken hold. And for the first time that night, I had the distinct feeling that whatever happened next was not going to stay small. The door slammed harder than it needed to, the sound cutting through the low hum of the room like a crack of thunder, and every instinct I had sharpened instantly, not because loud entrances were rare, but because of how wrong this one felt, careless, loud in a place that had just learned how to be quiet. I turned toward it before I could stop myself and saw him, mid-30s maybe, broad shoulders, expensive jacket worn like it was supposed to mean something, confidence spilling off him in the loud, obvious way that usually filled a room instead of bending it. He laughed too loudly at something no one else seemed to hear, clapped one of his friends on the back, and moved toward the bar like he owned the place. And for a split second, I felt relief because this was normal. This was the kind of energy I knew how to handle. The kind you could deflect with a smile and a quick comment, the kind that tipped well if you played along. But that relief faded almost immediately when I noticed something else, the way people moved out of his path, not casually, not like giving space, but like avoiding collision, like they did not want to be caught between whatever was about to happen. And when I glanced back toward the man at the end of the bar, he had not moved, not even slightly, but his attention had shifted, not fully, just enough, like a predator acknowledging a new presence without needing to turn its head. And that was when the tension snapped into something real, something I could not explain away as imagination anymore. "Hey," the new guy called out, sliding into a stool 2 seats away from him, his voice loud, careless. "Get me a whiskey." I stepped forward automatically, grabbing a glass, pouring from memory, because my hands knew what to do even when my thoughts did not. "Coming right up," I said, keeping my tone steady, but my eyes flicked between them before I could stop myself. And I saw it then, the smallest shift. The new guy glanced sideways, noticed him, and for a fraction of a second, his expression changed, not fear exactly, but recognition, sharp and immediate, like he had just walked into a room he did not expect to see occupied. And then it was gone, replaced with a grin that felt forced at the edges. "Did not expect to see you here," he said, leaning back slightly, trying to sound casual, trying too hard. I set the glass down in front of him, the soft tap louder than it should have been in the quiet that followed, and I did not miss the way his hand hovered over it for a second before actually picking it up, like his attention was split, like part of him was calculating something he did not want to show. Neither did I. The man at the end of the bar replied, his voice calm, even, the same tone he had used with me, but it carried differently now, heavier, like it meant more than the words themselves. I felt my pulse pick up again, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden awareness that I was standing in the middle of something I did not understand, something that had rules I had not been taught. "You been busy?" the new guy asked, taking a sip that seemed more for show than anything else, his eyes not quite meeting the other man's. "Always," came the answer, simple, controlled, and that was when the silence stretched, not empty, but full, like something was being said without being spoken. I shifted my weight, suddenly aware of how close I was, how easily I could become part of whatever this was without meaning to, and I told myself to step away, to give them space, but I did not move, not yet, because I wanted to understand, because part of me still believed I could read this, figure it out, reduce it to something simple, something safe. The new guy laughed again, but it came out tighter this time, shorter, still keeping things organized. He said, choosing his words carefully now, and there it was again, that subtle change in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. I glanced at the man I had been teasing not 20 minutes ago, and for the first time, I saw something different in his expression, not anger, not irritation, just a quiet certainty, like he already knew how this would end. "I do not leave things unfinished," he said, and the words landed with a weight that made my stomach tighten. The new guy nodded quickly, too quickly, taking another drink, but his hand was not as steady as before, and I realized then that whatever game he thought he was playing when he walked in, he was no longer in control of it, and neither was I. I took a step back finally, my heart beating faster now, not from anything that had happened, but from everything that had not, from the tension that filled the space between them, from the way the room had rearranged itself around one quiet man who had not raised his voice once. And as I turned to grab another glass, trying to return to something normal, something familiar, I heard his voice again, softer this time, directed not at the other man, but at me. "Emily," he said, and the fact that he knew my name without me ever telling him sent a chill down my spine. "Stay close." And I froze for half a second, because this time, it did not feel like a warning. It felt like a decision had already been made. I did not move right away, not because I did not hear him, but because I did, and that was the problem. The way he said my name like it belonged in his mouth, like he had already decided it did, sent a ripple through me that I could not shake, and for a second, I just stood there behind the bar with a glass in my hand, pretending I was busy while every instinct told me to step away, to create distance, to remind myself that this was just another shift, another night, another customer. But nothing about this felt normal anymore. And when I finally forced myself to turn back, both men were still exactly where I had left them, Except now the tension between them had sharpened into something almost visible, the kind of silence that does not need raised voices to be understood. You always did like making things difficult, the louder man said, his tone trying for casual but missing the mark by inches. He tapped his fingers against the side of his glass, not drinking now, just keeping his hands occupied, and I noticed how his shoulders had tightened, how his posture had shifted from relaxed to something more alert, like he was waiting for something he could not quite predict. Only when they are meant to be simple, Adrian replied, his voice still calm, still steady, but there was something colder underneath it now, something that made the air feel thinner. I set another glass down just to have something to do, wiping the counter again even though it did not need it, because standing still meant listening too closely, and listening too closely meant understanding more than I wanted to. You could have handled this differently, the other man continued, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice as if that would somehow make the conversation less noticeable, but it did not. Not in this room. Not anymore. I did, Adrian said, and that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement that seemed to settle something invisible between them. The other man let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. You always think you are in control, he said, and this time there was a hint of something sharper in his tone, something that felt like a challenge, and for a second, I thought maybe that would change things, maybe that would break whatever quiet hold Adrian had over the room, but it did not. Adrian did not react the way most people would. He did not raise his voice or lean forward or try to dominate the moment. He just looked at him, steady and unhurried, like time itself moved differently around him. I do not think, he said slowly. I know. And the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not because of the words, but because of how certain they sounded, how final. The other man's jaw shifted slightly, his fingers tightening around the glass before loosening again, and I realized then that whatever he had expected when he walked in, this was not it. This was something else entirely, something he was already losing ground in, even if nothing had technically happened yet. I took another step back, putting more distance between myself and the conversation, but it did not feel like enough. Not when Adrian's earlier words still echoed in my head. Stay close. Not a suggestion, not a request, something closer to a boundary I had not agreed to, but somehow found myself respecting anyway. And that scared me more than anything else, because I did not understand why I listened, why I hesitated instead of walking away like I should have. Look, the other man said after a moment, his voice quieter now, more controlled, like he was recalculating. We can fix this, whatever it is. It does not have to turn into something bigger. I watched Adrian carefully, waiting for some kind of reaction, some shift that would tell me how this would play out. But he did not move right away. He just let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle until the other man shifted again under it. And then, finally, he spoke. It already is, he said, and the words landed with a quiet certainty that made it clear there was no negotiation left in them. The other man swallowed, his confidence slipping in small, almost invisible ways, and I realized then that this was not about anger, not about ego. This was about control, about decisions that had already been made long before tonight. And for the first time since he walked in, I felt something close to unease settle deep in my chest, not because I thought something dramatic was about to happen, but because I understood, finally, that whatever world Adrian belonged to, it did not operate on second chances. And as I stood there, caught between the life I knew and the one I had accidentally stepped into, I realized I had made a mistake earlier, the biggest one of the night. I had thought he was harmless, and now, watching the way an entire situation folded around him without him ever raising his voice, I understood just how wrong I had been. The words settled heavier than anything else that night, not loud, not dramatic, just final, and I felt it in the way the other man's shoulders dropped slightly, like something inside him had already accepted an outcome he could not change, even if he had not said it out loud yet. And for a moment, nobody spoke, not him, not Adrian, not even the rest of the room, which had somehow grown quieter without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale slowly, gripping the edge of the counter just to ground myself in something familiar, something solid, because everything else felt like it was shifting in ways I could not see clearly. You are making this bigger than it needs to be, the man said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the careless confidence he had walked in with. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about where this was going. Adrian did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch. Again, deliberate, controlled, like he understood exactly how much pressure it applied without needing to raise his voice or change his tone. And I watched as the other man shifted under it, his fingers tapping once against the glass before going still, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door, toward the people around us, like he was measuring something, calculating options that were quickly disappearing. It was a misunderstanding, he added, quicker this time, like he was trying to correct something before it settled too deeply. But Adrian's expression did not change, not even slightly. You misunderstand many things, he said calmly, and the words were not sharp, not loud, but they landed with a quiet weight that made the man's jaw tighten again. I swallowed, my gaze moving between them, feeling more and more like I was standing in the middle of a conversation I was never meant to hear. A conversation where the outcome had already been decided long before I stepped into it. And I could not shake the feeling that I was part of it now. Whether I wanted to be or not. We can talk about this somewhere else, the man said, glancing around again, his voice dropping even lower, almost careful now, not here. And for the first time since he walked in, there was something close to caution in his tone, something that did not match the man who had slammed the door open like he owned the place. Adrian followed his gaze briefly, just enough to acknowledge the room, the people, the quiet attention that pretended not to exist, and then his eyes returned to him, steady, unmoved. It is already here, he said, and I felt that sentence more than I heard it, because it meant this was not about location, not about privacy. This was about something that could not be moved or delayed, something that had already taken shape the moment they saw each other. The man exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, and I saw it then. The moment his control slipped just enough to be visible. Not panic, not fear exactly, but the realization that he was no longer steering the situation, that whatever path he had expected was gone, replaced by one he could not redirect. You always do this, he muttered, quieter now, almost to himself, but Adrian heard it. Of course he did. He heard everything, saw everything, and chose exactly what to respond to. I finish what begins, Adrian said, and there it was again, that certainty, that calm, unshakable certainty that made everything else feel temporary in comparison. I shifted. My weight again, my heart beating faster now, not because of anything that had happened physically, but because of what I was starting to understand. That power did not always look loud. It did not always announce itself. Sometimes it just existed, steady and immovable, until everything else adjusted around it. And that was what I was seeing now, not a confrontation, not an argument, but a quiet unfolding of something inevitable. The man looked at his drink, then back at Adrian, and for a second, I thought he might say something else, push back again, try one more time to regain footing, but he did not. He just nodded once, slow, controlled, like he was accepting terms that had never been spoken out loud. Fine, he said, his voice flat now, stripped of everything it had before. Then we will do it your way. And even though I did not know what that meant, I felt the shift immediately, the way the tension changed from uncertain to resolved, from unpredictable to decided. Adrian inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, not exactly, but in acknowledgement, like this was simply the next step in something already set in motion. And then, finally, he moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to stand, smooth and unhurried. And the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The room adjusted again, people shifting, conversations lowering, space opening around him without anyone being told to move. And I realized, standing there behind the bar with my hands still gripping the counter, that this was the moment everything changed, not because of what he did, but because of what everyone else did in response. And when his gaze found mine again, just for a second, I felt it. Clear and undeniable. I was no longer just watching this unfold. I was inside it now, and there was no stepping back to where I had been before. The moment he stood, everything followed, not in a loud or obvious way, but in that same quiet, controlled shift I was starting to recognize, like the room itself understood something I did not. Chairs adjusted slightly, voices dropped just a fraction lower, and the man across from him straightened instinctively, his posture tightening, as if he had just remembered exactly who he was dealing with. And I stayed where I was, hands braced against the counter, because moving felt wrong, like stepping into a current I could not see but could already feel pulling at me. Adrian did not rush. He never rushed. He set his glass down with the same precision as before, the soft sound of it meeting the wood somehow louder than it should have been. And then he turned slightly, not fully toward the other man, just enough to make it clear that the next move belonged to him. "We are done here," he said, not as a suggestion, not as a question, just a statement that left no room for interpretation. The other man hesitated, just for a second, and that second told me more than anything else had all night, because hesitation meant uncertainty, and uncertainty did not belong to someone who had walked in acting like he owned the place. "Right," he said finally, his voice controlled again but thinner now, like he was holding it together by choice instead of instinct. He stood as well, slower, more deliberate, and I noticed how he kept a careful distance, not stepping too close, not crossing an invisible line that I could not see but could suddenly feel. They did not shake hands, did not exchange anything that looked like agreement, but something passed between them anyway, something silent and final, and then the other man stepped back. One step, then another, creating space where there had been tension just seconds before. "Take care of yourself," he added, and the words sounded polite, but there was something underneath them that felt more like resignation than courtesy. Adrian did not respond, not verbally. He simply held his gaze for a moment. Longer, long enough to make the other man look away first, and that was when I understood, really understood. This was not about who spoke louder or acted bigger. This was about who did not need to. The man turned then, moving toward the door with none of the confidence he had entered with, his steps quicker now, more focused on leaving than arriving. And as the door opened and closed behind him, the room seemed to breathe again. Conversations picking up slowly, cautiously, like people were testing the air before fully committing to normal. I stayed frozen for a second longer, watching the space where he had been, trying to piece together something that made sense, something that fit into the world I knew, but nothing did, nothing about this fit. And then I felt it again, that awareness, that pull. And when I looked back, Adrian was already looking at me, not the room, not the door, me, like the rest of it had already been handled, and I was the only thing left worth his attention. My throat felt dry all of a sudden, and I forced myself to move, grabbing a clean glass, wiping it even though it did not need it, just to have something to do with my hands, something to anchor myself. "So," I said, my voice quieter than before, less certain, "that happens a lot?" It was a weak attempt at normal, and I knew it the second the words left my mouth, but I could not help it. I needed to say something, needed to remind myself that I was still me, still in control of my own space. Adrian watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he took a step closer, not invading, not aggressive, just closing the distance enough to make it clear that he could, that he chose when. Space existed between us. "No," he said simply, and that single word carried more meaning than a full explanation ever could. I swallowed, setting the glass down a little too quickly, the sound sharper than I intended. "Then what was that?" I asked, because I could not stop myself anymore, could not pretend I was not involved when everything in me was already reacting to him, to this, to whatever world he had just revealed without actually showing anything. He tilted his head slightly, studying me again in that quiet, focused way that made me feel like he saw more than I wanted him to. "That," he said slowly, "was someone realizing too late what he should have understood from the beginning." And the words settled into me with a weight that made my chest tighten, because I knew, deep down, that they were not just about the man who had just left, they were about me too, about the way I had laughed earlier, the way I had leaned in, the way I had thought I was in control of something I clearly was not. I crossed my arms lightly, not in defiance this time, but in something closer to self-protection. And what exactly was he supposed to understand? I asked, my voice steady but softer now. Adrian's gaze did not waver, not for a second. "Limits," he said. And there it was again, that quiet certainty, that calm control that made everything else feel temporary in comparison. And as I stood there, looking at him across a bar that suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour ago, I realized something that made my pulse quicken in a completely new way. I had not just crossed a line tonight. I had stepped into something I did not know how to leave, and for the first time since he walked in, I was not sure I wanted to. Limits, he said, and the words stayed with me longer than anything else that night, longer than the silence, longer than the way the room had shifted around him, longer than the look in the other man's eyes when he realized he had already lost. And I should have stepped back then, should have nodded, laughed it off, moved on to another table, another order, another version of normal, but I did not, because something in me refused to walk away from a line I could finally see, even if I did not fully understand it. You talk like everything has rules, I said, my voice quieter now, but steadier, like I was testing something carefully instead of pushing recklessly like before. Adrian did not answer right away. He watched me again. That same measured focus that made me feel like I was being evaluated instead of just seen. And for the first time, I did not try to hide from it. I held his gaze. Let the moment stretch instead of filling it with jokes or deflection. Everything does, he said finally, and there was no arrogance in it. No need to convince me. Just certainty. The kind that came from knowing something so completely it no longer needed explanation. I let out a small breath, glancing down at the counter for a second before looking back at him. And what happens when someone does not follow them? I asked. Even though I already knew I was one of those people, I had been all night, pushing, teasing, crossing lines I did not even know existed. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly, like I had asked the right question without realizing the weight of it. They learn, he said, simple, controlled, and that answer should have been enough. It should have made me step back, draw a boundary, remind myself that this was not my world, that I did not belong in whatever quiet system he operated in. But instead, I felt something else, something unexpected, curiosity, the kind that made you lean in even when you knew better. That does not sound optional, I said, and this time, there was no humor in it, no teasing edge, just an honest observation. Adrian took another small step closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to make the distance between us feel intentional, chosen, and my pulse reacted before I could control it. A quick, sharp beat that I knew he noticed even if he did not acknowledge it. It is not, he said, and the calm in his voice made the words heavier, not threatening, not aggressive, just true. I swallowed, crossing my arms again without thinking, less defensive now and more like I was holding myself steady. So what about me? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out faster than I intended, because it had been building since the moment he said my name without me giving it to him, since the moment he told me to stay close like it was already decided, since the moment I realized I was not just watching something unfold, I was part of it. Adrian's gaze did not leave mine, not for a second, and the silence that followed felt different from the others, not tense, not heavy, but focused, like the room had narrowed down to just the two of us, everything else fading into background noise I could barely hear anymore. You already know, he said quietly, and something in my chest tightened at that, because he was right. I did know, not the details, not the rules, not the structure of whatever world he belonged to, but I knew enough to understand that I had stepped into something I could not pretend was simple anymore. I shook my head slightly, a small, almost automatic denial. I do not, I said, even though it sounded weaker than I wanted it to, like I was arguing with something I had already accepted. He studied me for another second, then reached for his glass, lifting it but not drinking, just holding it there like he was considering something. You crossed a line, he said, and the words were calm, almost matter of fact, but they landed deeper than anything else he had said, because there was no judgment in them, no accusation, just acknowledgement. And I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now, because I needed to hear the rest, needed to understand what that meant for me, for this, for whatever had started the moment I decided to tease a man I thought was harmless. Adrian set the glass back down slowly, his fingers lingering on the edge for a fraction of a second before releasing it. And then he looked at me again, fully, completely, like nothing else existed in that moment. And now, he said, his voice lower, steadier, you do not get to pretend you did not. The words settled into me with a quiet finality, not trapping, not forcing, but closing a door I had not realized was still open. And for the first time that night, I felt it clearly, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, The kind that changes the way you see everything after it arrives. I exhaled slowly, my grip on the edge of the counter loosening as I straightened just a little, meeting his gaze without flinching this time. Without pretending I was still in control of something I clearly was not. And as the noise of the bar slowly returned around us, people talking, glasses clinking, life continuing like nothing had shifted at all, I realized something that made my pulse steady instead of race. I had been playing a game I did not understand, and now that I finally saw the rules, I was not stepping away, I was stepping further in. I should have walked away after that, should have taken his words as the boundary they were and returned to the safe rhythm of pouring drinks and counting tips. But something in me had already shifted, something that refused to go back to pretending this was just another night, just another customer, just another conversation I could laugh off and forget by the time I clocked out. And the strange part was, I did not feel trapped, I felt awake, like I had been moving through everything on autopilot before and now, suddenly, every detail felt sharper, clearer, more deliberate. The way his hand rested lightly on the bar, fingers relaxed but precise. The way his eyes never drifted, never lost focus. The way the space around him still held that quiet distance even as the rest of the room returned to its normal noise. I picked up a towel again, more out of habit than need, and wiped a spot that had already been clean, my mind replaying his words. You do not get to pretend you did not. And I realized he was right. I could not pretend anymore, not about him, not about what I felt standing this close to something I did not understand, but could not ignore. So what happens now? I asked, and this time there was no teasing in my voice, no challenge, just a question I needed answered. Adrian did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly past me, scanning the room in a way that looked casual but felt anything but, like he was always aware of everything at once. And then he looked back at me, steady, focused. Now, he said, you decide if you step back or step forward. The simplicity of it caught me off guard, because I had expected something more complicated, something that would tell me what to do, what this meant, what he expected. But instead, he left it with me, like the choice had always been mine even when it did not feel that way. I let out a small breath, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the counter as I considered it. Stepping back meant returning to the version of myself that had laughed earlier, the one who thought she understood people at a glance, who believed everything could be handled with a quick smile and a sharper comment. Stepping forward meant this, whatever this was, something unknown, something that did not follow the same rules I was used to, something that had already proven it could shift an entire room without raising its voice. And if I choose wrong? I asked quietly, because that was the part that mattered, the part that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment he first caught my wrist. Adrian's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something almost like approval, like I had asked the question that mattered most. Then you learn faster, he said, and there was no threat in it, no warning, just the same certainty that had been there all night. I shook my head slightly, a soft exhale escaping me, as I looked down for a second, then back up at him. You make it sound easy, I said, and he tilted his head just slightly, like he was considering the word. It is not, he replied, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something else in his tone, not softness exactly, but something less rigid, less absolute. But it is simple. I felt that settle into me differently, not as pressure, not as something I had to resist, but as something I could choose to accept. And that was the difference, I realized. He was not forcing anything. He was not pulling me into his world. He was standing exactly where he had always been and letting me decide if I would meet him there. The realization steadied something in me that had been off balance since the beginning of the night. I straightened slightly, my grip on the counter loosening as I met his gaze again, fully this time, without hesitation. You already know what I am going to choose, I said, not as a question, because I could see it in the way he watched me, in the way he had been watching me from the beginning, like he had already accounted for every possibility and still ended up here. Adrian did not smile, but something in his expression shifted, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. I know what you are capable of choosing, he said. And the distinction mattered more than I expected, because it meant he did not assume, he did not take. He waited. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him. The noise of the bar fading again as everything narrowed down to this moment, this choice. This line I had crossed and could not uncross. And then, without overthinking it, without giving myself time to retreat back into something safer, I stepped out from behind the bar, closing the distance between us by a single step, small but deliberate. And the moment I did, I felt it, the shift, not in the room this time, but in me. Like something had aligned instead of resisted. Adrian's gaze dropped briefly to the space I had just crossed, then back to my eyes. And for a second, neither of us spoke, because nothing needed to be said. The choice had already been made. And as I stood there, closer than I had been all night, fully aware of the line I had stepped over, I realized something that should have scared me, but did not. I was not wondering how to get out anymore. I was wondering what came next. The moment I stepped closer, the world did not explode. Nothing dramatic happened. No one gasped or turned to stare. The music kept playing. Glasses kept clinking. And people kept talking like they always did. But something shifted anyway. Something quieter. Something that only I seemed to feel. Like a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. And for the first time that night, I was not reacting. I was choosing. Adrian did not move right away. He did not reach for me or step back. He simply watched. That same steady, unreadable focus. But there was something different in it now, something that acknowledged the space I had closed on my own, and that mattered more than anything else he could have done. "You are still standing here," he said after a moment, his voice low, almost thoughtful, like he was confirming something rather than questioning it. I let out a small breath, steadying myself before answering. "I am," I said, and the words felt more certain than anything I had said all night, because they were not about him. Not about the room, not about whatever world he came from. They were about me, about the decision I had just made without pretending it was accidental. His gaze held mine for another second. Then he nodded once, subtle, controlled, but it felt like more than agreement. It felt like recognition, like I had just met a standard I did not even know existed before tonight. "Then do not step back," he said. And again, it was not a command, not something forced on me. Just a statement that carried the weight of expectation without pressure. I glanced around the bar briefly, taking in the familiar chaos that suddenly felt distant, like I was standing just outside of it even though I had not left my place. My manager was talking to someone near the register. The regulars were laughing at a joke I could not hear. Everything was exactly the same and completely different at the same time. And I realized that was the point. Nothing had changed on the surface, but everything had shifted underneath. "You always do this?" I asked quietly, turning my attention back to him. "Change things without doing anything?" Adrian's expression did not soften, but there was a faint trace of something almost like amusement in his eyes, subtle enough that I might have missed it earlier. "I do not change things," he said. "I let them show what they already are." I considered that, letting the words settle, because they made sense in a way I did not want them to. The room had not changed because of him. It had revealed itself around him. People had shown who they were, how they reacted, where they stood, and somehow, I had done the same without realizing it. I had shown him exactly who I was the moment I decided not to step back. "And what am I?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out softer than I intended, because it mattered more than I wanted to admit. Adrian did not answer immediately, his gaze moving over me briefly, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt precise, like he was placing me somewhere in a system I could not see. "Someone who does not walk away," he said finally. And the simplicity of it caught me off guard again, because it was not a compliment, not a judgment, just a fact. I let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and something more serious, because he was right. I had every reason to step back tonight, every opportunity to return to something safe and familiar, and I had chosen not to. "That sounds like it could be a problem," I said, but there was no real doubt in my voice anymore. Adrian's eyes held mine, steady, unwavering. "It depends on what you are standing in," he replied, and that answer stayed with me, heavier than anything else, because it meant this was not about right or wrong, safe or dangerous. It was about understanding where I was and deciding if I belonged there. I straightened slightly, the last trace of hesitation slipping away as I met his gaze fully, without flinching, without second-guessing. "And where exactly am I standing?" I asked, my voice calm now, grounded in a way it had not been before. Adrian did not look away, not even for a second. At the point where you stop guessing, he said, and the words landed with a quiet clarity that made everything else fall into place, because that was it. That was the difference between before and now. I was not guessing anymore, not about him, not about the room, not about myself. I understood enough to know I had stepped into something real, something structured, something that required more than quick instincts and surface-level confidence. And instead of pulling back, I felt something settle in me, something steady and deliberate, like I had found my footing instead of losing it. I nodded once, more to myself than to him. And as I did, I realized something that should have come with fear, but did not. It came with something else entirely, something stronger, clearer. I was not the same person